Welcome everyone to day 3 of the Changing Nature of Innovation Conference. The session today is on energy and environment. Our moderator for today is Ambuj Sagar. He is the Vipula and Mahesh Chaturvedi Professor of Public Policy Studies and the founding head of the School of Public Policy at the IIT Delhi. His interests lie broadly at the intersection of science, technology, and development. And Ambuj has a very impressive long bio, but he's requested me to just focus on the conversation today and keep it short. So I'm going to hand it over straight to Ambuj. So Ambuj, over to you. And thank you so much for doing this, all of you.
Um, Thank you, Janak. It's a pleasure to be here. Actually, it promises to be a very exciting session ahead of us uh, with two good speakers, and we'll get to that in a second. But also, the topic is something that's very near and dear to my heart, both the question of innovation, but also innovation for meeting energy and environmental challenges, which obviously, as we all know, is a really important uh, uh, question facing humankind today. I mean, actually, the reality is society is facing an enormous number of environmental challenges, and climate change, air pollution, water pollution, plastic waste. I mean, I can go on and on, and uh, and many of these really are these are global challenges. They are increasing in scale and a cause of huge concern. But there's also an understanding that new and improved technologies can play an important role in helping address these challenges. And uh, but the reality is that, as I say, there's many a slip betwixt the cup and the lip, right? And while we have the potential of technologies being able to help address these challenges, it's not easy to realize the potential of the technologies, and it's kind of a tricky game to get it right. And I think that is precisely where scholarship can really help us understand, give us insights into the innovation process, and give some guidance on how we might be able to close the gap between the potential of technologies and their impact in the real world. And today we are very fortunate to have two outstanding speakers who will give us some, I'm sure, very interesting insights on how India is managing technological change and innovation in the energy and environment area. In terms of running the session, let me suggest that we let both the speakers make their presentations, and then I'll reflect very briefly on the remarks, but then open it up to questions from the audience. So we really would like to have a very interactive session, if possible. So anybody who has a question to the speakers, or maybe a more general question, and uh, beyond the presentation, but asking the speakers to reflect on the topics, um, please enter those questions in the chat box. And but as you do so, please do add your name and affiliation so that we know who's asking what kind of questions. And I'll try to then, hopefully not too many questions, so I'll try to keep track of the questions, and get people to get the speakers to engage with them. But hopefully in this process, it'll be really kind of a lively and, pardon the pun, but energetic discussion. So with that, let's get the show on the road. The first speaker today is Santosh Kumar Sahu, who is an assistant professor of economics in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Madras. He is affiliated with the Center for Technology Policy at IIT Madras, and a fellow at ICEP. Um, he's got broad research interests that include energy economics, applied microeconomics, industrial economics, and the economics of global climate change. Before he joined IIT Madras, he was at the Madras School of Economics. And before that, he was doing his doctoral work at IIT Bombay, where he received an Excellence in PhD Research Award in 2012-13. Uh, and he also has spent a summer program at the National Bureau of Economic Research as part of Raghuram Rajan's Young Scholar Grant programs for economists, which I'm sure was a very um, uh, exciting experience, uh, working with other fellow economists at NBR and in my favorite city, Boston. So anyway, with that, Santosh, over to you. And after Santosh, I will then introduce the next speaker and then ask him to make a presentation, as I said, and then we'll open it up. Santosh, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Ambus, for the nice introduction. Can I share the screen? Thank you very much, Janak. In fact, he has been behind this lot of communication between me and Janak on discussing various topics, and then finally thinking of something which is really important in terms of linking it with energy, environment, and innovation. And it's been a pleasant experience with Janak and others as a pre-conference discussions, also to make the conference much more lively and possibly make it best for the audience and also for the presenters themselves. So today what I'm going to present is on the recent work that we are engaged on, basically to link technology, price instruments in terms of the tax and energy intensity. And for that matter, what I'm going to present is basically the initial works that has been done in terms of empirics, taking Indian data into context. Now, the reason for taking Indian data into context is, of course, what I have seen. CTIR has been involved a lot in terms of working on innovation at a various levels, including Indian manufacturing sector. And it's obvious that there has been a lot of issues related to data and methodologies, and also in terms of getting data for the analytic purpose. I take it forward of what Professor Ambus has just said, that we have a large issue in terms of climate change, impact of climate change. But in addition to that, we also have a challenge of data. That means we also have challenge of frequencies of the data, informations, not only particularly for the manufacturing sector, but also from other sectors of the Indian economy, as all of us know here. So what we know as of now, scientifically proved and has been debated across climate scientists, policy makers, and also the international policy bodies, is definitely climate change is one of the major challenges. Now, this challenge is not only sector specific, neither they are basically region specific, but we have heterogeneity in terms of climate change impact. We just remember recently the one of the cyclones that crossed across the state of Odisha and created a larger disaster. So starting from the household perspective of vulnerability to industrial vulnerability is something which is really important to understand. Now, before we get into the impact of climate change, that means how climate change is changing the ecology, changing the biodiversity and environment as a large, we need to also know that what are the causes of climate change. Now, of course, it's well documented, scientifically debated about the contribution of GHG emission, that is the greenhouse gas emission, particularly which started post-industrialized period in major economies, and India is no exception to that. Now, the increase in the GHG emissions create large amount of catastrophes, and typically they have a tendency to increase the temperature, and hence the other vectors of impacts of climate change follow up. So one of the most cited and most accepted reports on climate change has been the Stern reports, various reports of Stern that has been published. And one such report in 2008 suggests that we need an urgent requirement of correcting and coming up with cost-effective mitigation calls. Now, which typically ends up with the idea that somehow we have to control emissions. That means we have to control GHG emissions, of which majority is basically the contribution of CO2 emission, that is the carbon dioxide emission, getting into the GHG and creating the major changes in the climate change. Now, what is the target for that? The target right now is keeping the surface temperature below 2-degree pathways by 2100. Now, of course, it's a policy question. How many economy would be able to do that? Because there is a trade-off between development, industrialization, and ecological sustainability. So how many economies, how many countries are ready to kind of trade off between decreasing the temperature by including technology and innovations, or by shifting the existing energy consumption patterns? Because when we have a trade-off between development and environment, most probably, and in many cases, economies do look at economic development in the short run because employment generation is quite important factor. So in this context, what is the best possible solution that can come out is the involvement of technology and innovation, and particularly related to energy efficiency technologies. Now, technology that are energy efficient, technology that can make the industries and different sectors adapt to change or shift the energy consumption patterns are quite important in this particular context. And of course, economies are kind of targeting for that. For example, if we remember the clean development mechanism that was adopted a certain time back in Indian context, basically tried to technology transfer, and particularly in the energy sector, if we can look at the data, then it was mostly in the renewable energy sector. Now, of course, we need to have a consensus among economies how technology transfer can happen, who is going to get the benefit out of that, because economic benefit is one of the prime motive of of an optimal solution that comes as against the as against the sustainable development plan, because again there is a trade-off between economic profit vis-a-vis the societal profit in terms of sustainable development goals. So these are the largest setup that I want to begin the presentation with, and I follow up on the case of India because, of course, in the context of either you talk about the impact of climate change, or you talk about the energy dependency in terms of import bills for the crude oil, or in fact the dependency on the crude oil, increasing oil prices in the domestic market, or in fact the energy use pattern of Indian industries. India has been one of the central debatable region across the world. Given the post-industrialization policies in India, in fact, starting from the NEP, that is the New Economic Policy of 1991, the contribution of Indian industries has been quite positive in the first half, except the couple of last year where the contribution of manufacturing to the GDP has been slowing. In fact, there are a couple of write-up which we can say that whether we just lost the manufacturing-led growth in India and shifted to service-led growth. Of course, that's a different topic to be discussed. But in the context of the emission profile, if you see in a very quick 3 bullet points, we know that India is one of the highest global emitter in terms of aggregate emissions. That means we stand third in terms of global emitters. And we are the largest population in terms of the second largest population country, which all of us know nothing new about this information. Now, what is interesting is, with a large population base in India, that means we are the second largest population, the demand for goods and services are equally high. And when you have the demand for goods and services equally high, you need to basically think about improvising the industrial base so that you become independent of production system. Now, when you increase the possibility of industrial activities, then obviously you are consuming more of energy. And you need more of energy in terms of imports, because as of now India has been a largest importer of the crude oil from the international market, and then again you emit more. So the link is whether India can actually think of engaging in terms of innovation activities to make Indian firms energy efficient. What are the typical products that India can eye on in terms of producing, because we are already emitting a huge lot of carbon dioxide to the world. So we need to have a policy in terms of, as we know that the energy policy in India has begun after 2004 quite prominently, and we are fortunate to get some data on that from the Ministry of New and Renewable Resources, of course from the CSO website. But we need to have a concrete energy policy as a standalone policy for the understanding of the energy market. Now, if you look at the manufacturing sector, which I take the data of 2017, the Indian manufacturing sector contributes 23% to the GDP, which is quite a lot. But again, the question is, can we really increase the contribution? Because manufacturing is also one of the most important sectors to create employment. But on the other side, if you look at the commercial energy demand, the manufacturing sector demands mostly 60% and above the commercial demand of the entire economy. That means our manufacturing firms are typically energy intensive. They need more energy to produce goods and services, and thereby, because they're typically dependent on fossil fuel, they are typically increasing more of emissions, which is a matter of concern at this point. So if you look at the policy that has been published in various journals, papers, and academic discussions, I have taken just two, three in the context which are quite important at this point, is we need to focus on energy efficiency gain in terms of a policy target. And for that, we need technology advancement, and technology advancement is one of the prime need at this point of time to kind of make our industries energy efficient. And of course, India has also come up with the targeted emission to reduce to around 35% by 2030. However, it's a matter of question to see what we can achieve as compared to the 2005 emission levels. And probably that's one of the reasons why India has adopted renewable policy. And of course, there are a lot of investment going on in terms of solar missions, in terms of using solar cells and giving advantage in terms of various incentive to adopt the renewable resources such as solar and wind power. Now, what are the policies? The most prominent policies that has been documented and that has a larger impact in the industrial setup as of now. So I'm just picking some of the important policies in this case. And of course, these policies are centrally designed policies. And apart from these policies, there has been several state level policies which I'm not documenting at this case. So one of the most important policies has been the Energy Conservation Act of 2001, followed by the National Electricity Policy. We have the National Tariff Policy of 2006, followed by Integrated Energy Policy of, again, 2006, Hydro Power Policy of 2008, and National Action Plan for Climate Change of 2008. And one of the policies that is very important for the firm level, in fact, for the industrial level, is basically the last one, which is Performance, Achievement, and Trade, or known as the PAT scheme. So that allows the firms basically to improvise, their productivity in such a way that they basically reduce in terms of energy consumption and achieve higher energy efficiency goals. However, as discussed in the academic and policy discussions, there is always a trade-off between what seems to be efficient in terms of energy efficiency gain, whether it is a tax-based policy or an allocation-based policy. Now, for that context, what we are going to talk about, we are just trying to focus here on four major factors. The first is the price instruments, as I said. One is the tax. That means, is it possible for the government to generate tax incentives to the firm so that they would become energy efficient? That is number one. Can we make Indian firms energy efficient by giving some kind of a tax benefit? Number two, is it how technology is related with energy efficiency at this point of time? Whatever data we have, whatever firm level data we have from different sources, can we link technology vis-a-vis energy efficiency? Because that can give an a priori condition of whether technological advancement can help firms in achieving energy efficiency goal. Of course, here in this particular presentation, when I talk about technology, I refer to R&D, that is research and development expenditure, a subset of innovation that we can call off. And we try to link between the R&D expenditure and energy efficiency, which can become an a priori information for the policymakers. That means what happens if you give technological advancement to the firms, and whether the firms would be able to increase the energy efficiency due to the technological expenditure or due to the engagement with the technology. And interestingly, we have something called a productivity dilemma that links typically with the last few slides, where the objective of the firm, whether the firm would like to become energy efficient, vis-a-vis the firm would like to become productive and will produce more. That means whether the objective of the firm is basically to increase the output, or the objective of the firm would be increasing in terms of the energy efficiency gain. Because as all of us know that one of the most important objective of the firms is to profit maximize. So profit maximization can happen by increasing the output or by reducing the energy cost. Because if we look at the production function, then one of the element is the energy cost. And if the firm can actually reduce the energy cost, it becomes it basically cost minimizes, and which tends to profit maximization. Or If the firm can actually produce more, then it becomes profitable, because the participation in the domestic and international market increases, and thereby what happens, the firm becomes profitable. And the sole objective of a typical private firm is basically to kind of maximize profit, right? So this is called a productivity dilemma hypothesis, because there are two things. One is increasing output, and second is increasing energy efficient. Can the firm do both, or can the firm actually try to become energy efficient because there is a technology available, or there is a price instrument they have, that means they have some kind of tax benefit, or whether the firm would like to increase in terms of productivity through different other ways, cost minimize, and then become profitable, because the sole motive of a firm is basically to become profitable and maximize its revenue. Now, in this context, these four identified characters in terms of indicators are important. One is the tax, how much corporate tax the firm actually pays. That's one of the information that we are interested in. Second is technology. What is the level of R&D that the firm is basically spending? Number three, what is the idea of energy efficiency? And number four is the productivity dilemma. Now, if we look at the literature on energy intensity, there are four ways that somebody can estimate or calculate the energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is assumed to be an inversely relationship with energy intensity, because energy intensity is easy to calculate as compared to energy efficiency. So how do we calculate energy intensity in this case? So energy intensity can be calculated using four different methods. The number one being something called an economic definition, where you take the cost of energy and cost of output. The number two is you take a thermodynamics and economic definition, where you take the energy consumption in physical unit as a proportion to the output that is produced in monetary unit. Number four, you can take a pure thermodynamic definition, where you take thermodynamic, the energy consumed in terms of the physical unit as a proportion of output produced in a physical unit. And number four, you can take the prices of energy as a ratio to the output produced in terms of quantity. Now, as all of us know, in economics, the problem is, there are firms which are producing heterogeneous type of goods and services. Making the output unit similar or homogeneous is not possible. Therefore, the nearest approach is you transfer the output produced in terms of monetary units. So which means we cannot really change the output. We have to depend on the monetary unit of the output produced. But yes, in the case of energy, we have two possibilities. Number one, we can either take the cost of energy, or we can take the energy consumed in terms of physical unit. The advantage of taking energy into a physical unit is basically we're again homogenizing the energy used in a typical firm, and the limitation of using energy in terms of a cost or a monetary unit is some firms, basically the MSMEs, get the advantage of certain kind of subsidies in the energy cost, and thereby it might give you a misleading information when you take an economic definition of energy intensity. So therefore, what I have done in this case is I have taken the definition as per the thermodynamic economic definition, where you have energy cost in energy in terms of a physical unit as a proportion to the cost of output that is being produced at a firm level. So if you just look at the quick review of the literature, because when we have certain kind of empirical exercise, we need to back it up, or we need to have a standard understanding of how price instruments have been used to kind of increase the efficiency of firms in terms of energy efficiency gain, because energy efficiency gain is not the prime objective of a firm. However, it's a derived objective, because energy demand itself is a derived demand, not a direct demand. So interestingly, from 1920s, in fact 1932, 1920, Pigo has been talking about the pricing externality as one of the efficient outcomes. Of course, that has been debated. That is debated between incentives from tax or permit, and there has been multiple work done in this context to understand the notion of price instruments and how it is linked with the efficient outcome of a typical firm. However, if you go to the recent literature that is cited in terms of the similarity, or in fact the argument was between the Gaussian idea of permit vis-a-vis the Pigouvian idea of price instrument. So what does the recent literature talk about? The recent literature goes in line of tax. That means the recent literature says that if you reduce the tax, if you give a tax holiday, if you give tax incentives to the firm, then typically they adopt better technologies which are directly related to increase energy efficiency at the firm level. Of course, these papers are, or these research are not done in the context of India, and we need to have a clear analytical tool for the Indian economy, and we need to see whether the tax incentives have anything to do with energy efficiency gain or not. Now, coming back to the second idea of the paper is basically the role of technology, and that can be divided between two different important dynamics. One is the ecological economic context of promotion of technology, and the second one is the rebound effect. Now, both these ideas of technologies have been positively associated with increasing energy efficiency at firm level, and therefore technology innovation are one of the important drivers of firms apart from the tax debate of whether it's permit or tax. And if you look at the recent approach, productivity has been one of the major concerns of economists and academicians and policymakers. And every firm would like to increase productivity over a period of time, which leads to cost efficiency and output expansion. However, it is linked to something which is called a productivity dilemma, which I have already discussed in the beginning of the presentation. Now, having an idea of what we are going to do and the recent literature that has been focused on the three important factors of the central theme of the discussion today, these are the variables of interest that I'm going to talk about. And of course, there has been a lot of difficulty in getting the data because the firm level data is not ideally available as in other economies that is available for them. So, I mean, for the beginners of these particular presentations who are joined in this particular conference, we can have industrial data from two major sources. One is definitely the CSO, that is the Central Statistical Organization, and which has the annual survey of industries, and you can get data from the annual survey of industries. However, annual survey of industry does not give you data on the firm characteristics, which is the extreme right to your screen. Some of the important, for example, it doesn't give you the data on R&D intensity or R&D as well. So therefore, the most appropriate data in this context is the CMI Provis database, which is one of the highly used database for academic research papers from last couple of years. And the CMI Provis database has two major informations. One is the financial balance statement of the firms. It has audited, not audited, and it has a lot of other information. But interestingly, it has one segment which is very rarely used by major researchers. They work on energy economics area, is the energy information, which is given as a different set. However, there is a limitation to that because the firm which are reporting the balance statement, annual financial balance statement, do not necessarily report energy consumption patterns. Which means if there are 100 firms reporting the financial balance statement, less than 100 firms are reporting for the energy consumption pattern. And hence what happens, the sample becomes a little smaller because if you map it with the energy consumption vis-a-vis the financial balance statement, then the sample becomes a little smaller. And sometimes it's misleading because if we want to do certain kind of exercise for a particular sector, for example, the automobile sector, which I'm also doing a research at this point of time. Interestingly, you can see majority of them are using furnace oil. The Indian manufacturing firm is using more than 62 types of energy in the set of energy consumption patterns. Any combinations of them classified into 7 major categories. Interestingly, the furnace oil has been of high demand for the automobile sector, and we need to understand why. Is furnace oil one of the most efficient energy that is available for the Indian market, or is it because of the price? Is it because of the cost of furnace oil? So when we would like to do a study of intersectoral level, then it becomes still difficult if the sample size is smaller. This is one of the limitations when you basically club between the energy data given in the CMI and you have the data from the financial, audited financial statements of the firm. With this limitation, what we have done, we have taken both, and then we have tried to create the variable of interest, particularly classified into 5 important things. One is energy, of course, that is the prime motive at this point of time. We have created the definition in terms of energy intensity, energy efficiency, and we have created something called a markup. Now, what's the markup? Markup is nothing but an index that tries to understand firms in terms of whether they are consuming, they have a larger energy intensity within the sectors and between the sectors. That means you take the pharmaceutical sector, for instance, you calculate the energy intensity of pharmaceutical sector, create an average energy intensity of the sector, and figure out how many of them within the pharmaceutical sectors are consuming more energy and less energy. So which is indirectly an heterogeneity component that comes in terms of understanding energy efficiency, not the only generic way of calculating energy intensity, but also within firm behavior in between one particular sector. The second important one is the productivity, because that has been one of the prime motive of the firms to basically operate in an economy to increase the productivity over a period of time. Of course, we have taken output as one of the important factors because that can tell us about the productivity dilemma hypothesis. And the second being the total factor productivity in terms of TFP, which is estimated using the Levinson-Petrin technique of 2003, so that we can link between the energy intensity and the productivity and see whether productive firms are also energy intensive or not. The third being the energy intensity, that means how much money or how much amount of investment is gone from the firm to in the energy in the R&D domain, and what is the ratio with the energy that we with the net sales that we can compute. Then we have the tax portion where we calculate 2 different ways. One is the ratio between tax to profit. Second is tax to net sales. So this can basically tell us whether what happens if the firms becomes profitable and still pays larger tax vis-a-vis the firm's tax of the tax contribution to the nation as against the net sales. Now, apart from this 4 important subcategory of index, what we also are interested some covariates in the regression equation, which takes in the form of age of the firm, profit margin, exports, whether it's a polluting firm. The pollution is one of the interesting data that is not used heavily in the literature, which I'm going to talk in a few minutes. And also we try to see whether 100% FDI is approved in certain sectors at 3-digit level of the ASI classification. Now, coming to the pollution level, there is a note in the Ministry of Environmental, Forest and Climate Change, where they have identified firms into 4 different categories, like red category, green category, yellow category, and white category, where they are basically classifying the firms in 3-digit levels, where they identify whether the firm is a polluting firm or a non-polluting firm. And this is a wonderful information. So if we take this information from the ministry's website, map it with our data at the 3-digit level, then we are able to actually see that whether a polluting firm, as identified by the government in terms of the pollution load, is also an emitting firm. That means emitting more, because that can be one of the wonderful ideas to get the information from the government information and then plug it in the CMI data, which is easy to plug in. So we have tried to look at in terms of creating the categories and of pollution loads and see whether how they are related to the energy efficiency gain or energy intensity for the understanding of the data that we have.
Hey, Santosh, you have about 5 more minutes. Yeah, please.
Oh, 5 more minutes?
Yeah, approximately. Yeah, but
okay. Yeah. I'll rush through quickly.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So let's look at the sample as we have. So the first one in your left hand side of the screen is basically the amount of energy consumption in aggregate for the 3 types of firm: red categories, orange category, green categories. Now, obviously, the word red itself means they are highly polluting. The pollution load is more. So what we can see that the red category firms, even they are polluting, they are not consuming aggregate energy as compared to what the orange category firms are consuming. One note from this particular graph. But on the other side, if you look at the energy intensity as well, the orange category firms have higher or larger energy intensity as compared to the red category firms. That means pollution polluting forms, which also doesn't necessarily air pollution. It is also a combination of other pollutions, are not correlating with the idea of energy intensity and aggregate energy consumed. So let's talk about certain kind of estimation that I'm interested here to discuss. Of course, I have a limited time with me. So what has happened is I have created the basic model by taking productivity, tax to net sales, tax to profit, and the markup dummy as the first model, then created a model for the productivity dilemma to basically take the square of the productivity, and then take the lag energy intensity model, assuming that what happens last year's energy intensity with current year's financial data. So what is interesting from these basic models are basically that productivity has an inverse relationship with energy intensity, meaning productive forms are energy efficient. So the first observation is we have to make forms productive, and once they're productive, then the energy intensity would come down, or indirectly the energy efficiency would go up. There is a productivity dilemma because we get a nonlinear relationship between the productivity and the square of productivity, as given in the second column of this table. And lag energy intensity is an interesting result that the last 2 years lag has an impact on the current year in terms of increasing energy intensity. What you can see, so inverse relationship can be established between lag of 2 periods to the current data that we have for the data on the t+1. Now, however, this result cannot be taken as it is because this is a fixed effect regression model. It doesn't control for the statistical bias. It is not one of the most efficient way of estimating. So what has happened is we try to look at the similar kind of estimation using a quantile regression, because we have a distribution of energy intensity which can be created as a quantile, and the result is almost similar to what we get in terms of a fixed effect estimate. However, there are firms which are engaging in exports. There are firms which are basically having different ways in terms of the covariates, and there are firms which are approved to 100% FDI. And having 100% FDI essentially would increase the exports, and thereby they have some kind of a relationship with energy intensity. To check this, what we have done, we took the basic model modified with a GMM estimate technique, where this is a better model as compared to the model shown in the previous case, because technology was not coming as interestingly as in this case. For example, here I would like to focus only on the technological variable, which is the R&D intensity. So systematically in all three models, from the basic model to the productivity dilemma model to the lag model, all of them statistically significant and negatively related to the energy intensity, meaning innovation in terms of R&D participation and R&D spending has a negative role with energy intensity, which means firms that are investing or spending more on R&D are typically becoming energy efficient. So what we have to do, we have to now come up and think about the policies related to how we can increase the participation of R&D in the firm level for the Indian context. Similarly, we have taken the lag of energy intensity, where again the focus is on R&D intensity. So this can be considered as a robustness check against the earlier estimate, which is typically an econometric exercise, but the results generally do not vary between these two models. So what do we find? These are the two important things that we come up with this exercise. The number one is technology in terms of R&D helps firm in gaining energy efficiency. However, there is a presence of productivity dilemma. That means the threshold point when the firm tried to escape from the inverted U-shape, similarly like the case of the environmental Kuznetsov hypothesis, when the production is much more, then the firms become energy intensive instead of energy efficient. And higher tax induces higher energy intensity as present. That means tax do not necessarily help Indian firms in achieving energy efficiency gain. Therefore, we have to think about our energy policies in much detail, that whether we need to actually give tax incentives, or we need to think about the permit scheme. At this point of time, using this data, what comes out is permit is much easier in Indian context as compared to the tax benefit. However, technology is definitely more interesting. Now, what are the follow-up questions from this analysis, which I have to look at in detail? Now, the first thing is what we figure out in the descriptive statistics is moderate Markov forms are basically pollute. They are more polluting, they pay more, rather than the reducing energy consumption. Then the question is why? That means why orange category forms are energy intensive. What is the nature of these forms? Number one. Number two, what could be the role of technology and innovation on energy intensive forms? For example, aluminum is energy intensive forms. Is there any difference between the sector specific instead of clubbing them together as I have done in this case? Number three is permit scheme is effective against tax because we didn't find an evidence of tax has a negative relationship with energy intensity. And what about creating an index of innovation, taking the data, whatever we have, and linking with the energy intensity debate? And how about thinking an innovation index and energy efficiency, and probably thinking of some kind of a time series analysis to kind of see the causation between the innovation activity and the energy efficiency gain. With this, thank you very much. And this is a collaborative research between a couple of my friends and my student Prantik Bakshi and Ajay and Kim, who is basically from one of the institutions in the France and Nottingham University, UK. So it's a collaboration work going on right now. So we are looking forward for the comments, suggestions, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. And thank you, Professor Ambuj, to actually give me the opportunity to present in this particular conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Santosh. And you don't have to thank me for giving the opportunity. The opportunity was given to you by your colleagues from CTIER. But it's a pleasure to be helping moderate this discussion. We have the second speaker now, and as I said, we'll let both the speakers give their presentations and then open it up to a Q&A after that. So the second speaker is Abhishek Malhotra, who is actually a colleague and assistant professor at the School of Public Policy at IIT Delhi. Abhishek's research focuses on policy design for low carbon development. He did his graduate studies from ETH Zurich, from where he got both a PhD and a master's degree in energy science and technology. And but before that, he actually turns out did a BTech in mechanical engineering from IIT Delhi, where I actually had known him as a teacher. So it's a pleasure to have him back at IIT as a colleague. While he was in Switzerland, he received the Swiss Government Excellence Scholarship for international students, and he's had actually set of interesting experiences before joining IIT. He worked as a consultant for the World Bank, for UNDP, was an intern for IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency in Bonn, and at the Division for Technology and Logistics at UNCTAD in Geneva. So some nice applied experience before wandering back into the world of academia. With that, Abhishek, over to you for your presentation. So about 30 minutes, and I'll give you maybe a 5-minute flag. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you, Ambuj, for that kind introduction. And before I start, I'd like to thank again everybody at Ahmedabad University and CTIER for the opportunity of presenting here. I'm very excited to be here. So I'm presenting some of, I would say, a mishmash of thoughts on India's low carbon development strategy and the inherent trade-offs that are present within that. And to illustrate some of these trade-offs, I'm going to be using the example of the solar PV sector in India. And this presentation draws on a lot of work that I've done in the past, but also that I'm currently doing. So just to set the background a little bit, I know that Santosh has already provided a great background on climate change mitigation and why it's relevant and important and needs to be addressed. But I'm still going to reiterate some of those things because I think they're important enough to bear repeating, and also because that's how I prepared my presentation. So basically, if you look at this graph, on the y-axis, you have so first, every bubble in the graph represents a country, and the size of the bubble represents the population of the country. On the y-axis is the log of energy use per capita in that country. And on the x-axis, you have the Human Development Index. So basically, you see that broadly, there is a strong correlation between per capita energy use and with measures of human development. And basically, if a country like India wants to move towards the right on this graph, and if a country like India follows the same trajectory as other countries have done in the past, we can expect their energy use to increase significantly in the near future. In the past, this increase in energy use globally has also been associated with significant rises in greenhouse gas emissions. So here on the y-axis, you see the amount of CO2 equivalents that are emitted by sector. So majority of the increases in greenhouse gas emissions historically have come from electricity production and from transport, but there are other sectors also that are very important in terms of addressing climate change. So basically what needs to be done is we somehow need to either decouple this trajectory of human development either with energy use or with increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And to do so, technological change is a key lever. And given the scope and rapidity with which technologies need to change globally, public policy will play an important role in changing the rate and direction of technological change to decarbonize the energy sector and to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So there are reasons to be optimistic because in the recent past, the pace of technological change and innovation in low carbon technologies has meant that there has been a change in perception when it comes to looking at climate change mitigation globally. So internationally, we've seen that there has been a shift in climate change governance to the national level where countries are making commitments for climate change mitigation voluntarily. And there's an increasing recognition that there's not necessarily a trade-off between economic development and climate change mitigation, but that there can be complementarities as well. So low carbon energy policies are increasingly being seen as an economic opportunity rather than as a burden or a cost by countries. I'll illustrate some of the things that I'm talking about here through the case of India. So in India, we've seen a range of national level plans and policies to capitalize on these new and emerging industries that are being created around renewable energy, energy efficiency technologies. So for example, we had the National Solar Mission. One of its goals was to enable India to have a leadership role in low cost and high quality solar manufacturing. Similarly for LEDs, stated policy goal has been to enable domestic manufacturing of LED bulbs. Similarly for advanced batteries now, with lithium-ion batteries becoming cheaper and cheaper and electric mobility becoming more and more viable, there are big announcements, at least so far, and recently incentives as well to localize manufacturing of lithium-ion batteries. So India right now is at a stage where it's looking to decarbonize its economy, but also at the same time try and capitalize on the economic and industrial opportunity posed by some of these technologies. But there are several tensions and trade-offs that exist because there are multiple policy goals which can be more or less aligned with each other. So the broader framework within which I'm looking at things is how does public policy play a role in bringing about technological change and changing its rate and direction? And by technological change, I mean the innovation and diffusion of new technologies. And how do these technologies then contribute to different policy goals within the energy sector? So typically within the energy sector, you have some major policy goals such as limiting the cost of energy, providing universal access, climate change mitigation, and establishing industry. Some people might add a fifth policy goal related to energy security, but I am not at all an expert of that in that, so I will not be talking about that in the rest of my presentation. But it is important to understand how these goals relate to each other and how prioritization of certain goals might lead to very different strategies and outcomes at the national level for India. So I'm going to dive a little bit more into the case of solar PV. This graph basically shows year by year the cumulative installed capacity of solar photovoltaics. Here, the purple color shows India. So although there are much bigger markets globally, China being the biggest one, and the US taking the lead, India still represents a very big market for solar PV technology today. If we look at the past trends for annual installed capacity of solar PV in India, we can see a story of tremendous growth. So since 2009, annually, we have been deploying more and more solar PV, although there has been some volatility and some uncertainty regarding market outlook. On the whole, it is commonly accepted that this is a market that is on the up, and there is a tremendous opportunity in the future as well. So in this final graph, we see that even after all this deployment, solar PV only represents 4% of the total power generation of the country. So there is growth in the total generation, as we see on the right axis and this black line. Solar PV has kept pace with that growth and also exceeded it. So it represents an increasingly larger share of electricity generation in the country, but still it is very small as compared to everything else at the moment. So the key point that I want to make here is that India is emerging as a major market for solar PV. There is some uncertainty and volatility, but the potential is enormous. So that's on the demand side. Now, if you look at the technology push side, so what is being done in the industry in India in terms of innovation and manufacturing, this graph shows you country by country, the share of solar PV patent families by country. So we see that historically Japan has played a very important role in terms of patenting, which I'm using here as a proxy for innovation. So these patents have not been adjusted for patent quality, but still in rough terms, they do show that initially Japan had a big lead in terms of innovating, and gradually China has really caught up and exceeded all other countries and is by far the largest country in terms of patenting in solar PV. In the middle of all these countries, I promise that India is in there somewhere. It's just not visible, but you have to trust me that it is in there. Similarly, in terms of manufacturing, we see that China, while increasing its patenting, also mirrored that quite well with increase in its market share for photovoltaic cells. So historically, the US was the market leader, which was then overtaken by Japan, which soon after that was overtaken by China. So the solar PV industry is highly competitive, and no single firm or no single country has been able to maintain a market lead for very long. Although that might be different now that the industry is much more mature, stable, and consolidated, and China has a significant market share. So overall, India has lagged quite a bit in terms of innovation and manufacturing. So just from these high-level numbers, we see that there is kind of a gap that has been left in terms of India's solar PV journey. So there has been a lot of emphasis on deployment, on cost reduction, but perhaps not that much emphasis or not that much success in terms of manufacturing or innovation, although that has been a stated policy goal for Indian policymakers since quite a while now. So to try and understand this a little bit, I want to do a little bit of a deep dive into the institutional history regarding the governance of renewable energy in India. And these insights are part of current work, which I'm doing together with my colleague Dwarkeshwar Dutt and Professor Ambuj Sagar at IIT Delhi. So we found that the origins of India's energy policy go way back to the 1970s, to the first oil shock when India first started focusing on renewables. And that led to the establishment of the Department of Non-Conventional Energy Sources, which eventually became what is now known as the Ministry of Renewable Energy. And the early emphasis was a lot on small-scale R&D, experimental deployment, and basically trying to understand how can renewables facilitate energy access. Because remember, back then, energy access was a major policy goal where India had very low energy access levels. So renewable energy was seen as a way to facilitate this. In the 80s, we saw the maturation of the administrative institutions for renewable energy governance. So we saw a lot of institutions that are in the country today, as well as precursors to the institutions that we see today. So we had the Commission for Additional Sources of Energy, the Department of Non-Conventional Energy Sources, which I just talked about. We had IREDA, the Indian Renewable Energy Development Agency, and the Ministry of Non-Conventional Energy Sources. So during this phase, a lot of emphasis was, again, on deployment of biogas, subsidized distribution of solar water heaters, solar cookers, and solar dryers. And an interesting thing to note here that a lot of the metrics that the ministry used during this time were actually around number of units that were distributed or deployed. So since an early stage, you see that there was an emphasis within the institutions and alignment of incentives around deployment and diffusion of technologies. This got a boost in the 90s when India opened up its economy, and that reflected within the power sector as well, where there was increased participation of private players, and there was a movement within the renewable energy space away from subsidized distribution to more market-based orientation in the sector. So there was a shift towards creating sustainable markets, which primarily affected the wind sector, where you saw companies like Suzlon coming in and using the markets that were created to really build up their capabilities, participate in global knowledge networks by through joint ventures, as well as licensing of knowledge with European firms. So wind was a big gainer during this time, but solar PV was still seen as, because of its high prohibitive cost, as a solution for decentralized energy and for rural electrification. And gradually, we also saw climate change as a major driver for expansion of renewable energy. So the National Action Plan of Climate Change, as Santosh talked about, was launched in 2008, where India announced its intention to become a global leader in renewable energy, and particularly in solar PV through the National Solar Mission. So since 2009 till the present, this phase has been characterized by adoption of ambitious RE targets. So India has announced a series of successively more ambitious renewable energy deployment targets. There has been a lot of emphasis on scaling up solar PV and achieving cost reductions. And although there has been an undertone constantly of building industry, it's only now in the past year, I would say, that things are slowly, gradually starting to take off. So I want to look a little bit deeper onto the demand side now. So what are the trade-offs when it comes to the demand pull policies for solar PV? So according to the literature on policy mixes, we know that you have different policy goals. We talked about these 4 different goals earlier in the presentation. And the literature on policy mixes says that ideally these goals and instruments should all be aligned with each other. They should be consistent, coherent, and congruent. And so this is a study that I focused on during my dissertation, where I looked at how do policy goals and instruments in an electricity sector policy mix interact with each other. And for this, I looked at the case of Uttar Pradesh, which has ambitious targets for financial reform of utilities, for solar PV deployment, as well as electricity access. So these are the 3 key goals that define a lot of policies within the state. And I used interviews as well as techno-economic modeling to highlight some of these interactions. But I'm going to quickly present a brief overview of the findings of the study. So a bit of background here. Distribution utilities in India are often seen as the weak link of India's power sector, where in a lot of states they are making losses perennially. So these are due to multiple reasons, because of lack of rationalized tariffs, because of lack of efficiency in terms of reducing technical and commercial losses. So basically, distribution utilities have been the focus of a lot of policy instruments to get their finances in shape, to make them financially viable so that they are no longer making losses and are operating on sound financial principles. So in 2015, there was the Uday scheme, which was announced, which had a goal to reduce technical and commercial losses to 15% by 2019. And there was another goal to close the gap between the average cost and revenue for distribution utilities by 2019. The key issue being that the costs incurred by utilities were much higher than the average revenue that they were recovering per unit of electricity sold. At the same time, you had goals for solar PV deployment. So at the state level in Uttar Pradesh, you had goals for both utility scale and rooftop solar PV deployment. And these were to be achieved by conducting auctions for utility scale solar PV and having incentives through gross and net metering and providing a 30% upfront subsidy for rooftop solar PV. And there are interactions between the two. So if are able to reform the finances of the utility, if there is progress towards these goals, it has a positive influence on solar PV deployment as well. Because from a private investor's perspective, having a financially sound counterparty reduces investment risk and makes deployment much less risky, makes it much easier to access capital, and reduces uncertainty in terms of returns, in terms of whether you're going to be paid for the electricity that you're selling to the distribution utility and whether you're going to be paid on time. At the same time, since financial reform was also to be achieved through increasing retail tariffs, that could potentially also have another positive effect on solar PV deployment, because commercial and industrial customers, which are basically the cash cows for distribution utilities, because these are some of the customers that pay the highest retail tariffs and are the most creditworthy. So they form a significant chunk of revenues for distribution utilities. If the retail tariffs for these customers go up, there's an increased business case for deployment of rooftop solar PV for commercial and industrial customers, because then they can save on these high retail tariffs. But in the opposite direction, things are not as rosy. These policy goals don't perfectly complement each other. Although reductions in cost in solar PV can help utilities in reforming their finances, because solar PV then represents a cheap way of purchasing electricity. Deployment of rooftop solar PV, particularly for commercial and industrial customers, is something that distribution utilities do not like. So since increased self-consumption of electricity through industrial and commercial customers from rooftop solar PV leads to lower sales for distribution utilities, for them it is a loss of revenue. So this is something that they do not want to see happening. And so you can often see distribution utilities sitting on their hands and not making it the easiest to deploy some of these rooftop solar PV systems for commercial and industrial customers. At the same time, you have these ambitious goals for electricity access, where the goal was to provide grid connections to 14 million households by March 2019 under the Saubhagya scheme. Officially, that was achieved, but there are questions as to the long-term sustainability of these connections that were provided to a lot of customers. And this was to be incentivized through performance-linked grants to the utilities, which covered 60% of the costs and the rest of it was to be covered through loans, where 50% of those loans would be converted to grants on early completion of these projects. So theoretically, financial reform should also have a positive influence on electricity access, because that means that the utilities have the financial resources to invest into distribution infrastructure. But practically, that is not the case, because almost all of this distribution infrastructure is funded through fiscal transfers from the central government. The other way around, the expansion of the customer base, who are largely in rural areas and are residential customers, is not an attractive prospect for distribution utilities at all, because these are typically cross-subsidized customers, and without adequate measures to increase the cross-subsidizing base, or without concomitant increases in subsidies allocated to the distribution utilities, it just means that for every kilowatt hour of electricity that they sell to rural customers, they're actually losing money, which then negatively impacts the finances of the distribution utilities, worsening their financial state. So we see that there are a lot of complex interactions through which solar PV deployment directly or indirectly does get affected, where counterparty risk is a major risk that influences solar PV deployment. A missed opportunity over here is the role of solar PV deployment in provision of electricity access. So although Uttar Pradesh had a policy framework in 2015 for decentralized mini grids, that basically got sidelined because of the Saubhagya scheme, where a lot of attention and resources were diverted towards grid extension and decentralized rooftop solar PV systems, as well as mini grids, were not seen as a viable or desirable alternative for rural electricity access. So that's on the demand side. Now let's look at the supply side. So some of the points that I'm going to talk about are...
Abhishek, 5 minutes.
All right. In this op-ed that I recently wrote with a current colleague at IIT Delhi, Anurag Panda, where we talked about how the volatility and uncertainty in the domestic market is a major risk for solar PV manufacturing and is a major disincentive for setting up any kind of manufacturing at scale, which can be competitive. So there's a major need to address counterparty risk and avoid renegotiation of power purchase agreements and address difficulties with land acquisition for solar manufacturing if we are to mobilize investments into manufacturing facilities. At the same time, we need to shift towards not only competing on price, but building long-term innovation capabilities. So earlier this year, there were incentives for manufacturing solar panels that were announced in the form of production-linked incentives. So for every unit of solar modules that you produce, you get an incentive from the government, as well as in the form of custom duties on imports. But there is a need to have periodic, time-bound, and realistic targets related to plant capacity for manufacturers, capacity utilization factors, module efficiency, price, and R&D investments. And you need to have a sunset clause for these subsidies, because right now they are for 5 years, but for a lot of investors, that's not a long enough time horizon to have enough investment certainty. So there is a need to have these targets and tie the incentives to these and make them contingent on meeting these targets for manufacturers to have a constant incentive for performance improvements and innovation in the sector. And finally, there is and overall the need to have clarity in prioritization of policy goals. So it seems so far that implicitly the provision of clean, abundant, and cheap electricity has been the primary goal that has driven a lot of policy in the sector. And if indeed that is to be prioritized, we should just buy solar panels perhaps from where they are cheapest, that is from China. If the policy goals is maybe job creation, then perhaps we should focus more on decentralized and rooftop solar PV, where the majority of jobs are, which is a segment that currently remains quite neglected as compared to large-scale utility-scale solar. But if the strategic localization of supply chains and having local manufacturing is in fact a major policy goal that we want to realize, then perhaps we'll have to live through the short-term pain of paying more for electricity from locally produced modules, because they are still much more expensive than what we can buy from China. And then these points come into play. So we need to have a large enough market which allows manufacturers to achieve scale, to gain enough experience and learning by doing, to, in the longer term, become competitive with global manufacturers. And finally, I want to highlight here once again that this is a risky strategy. The solar PV sector has low barriers to entry, and it is very difficult and costly to maintain a long-term competitive advantage. So this is something that needs to be combined with mitigation strategies. So we need to monitor progress towards these policy goals constantly and make subsidy contingent on progress towards these policy goals, so that we don't end up paying exorbitant amounts of public funds for a policy goal that does not get achieved in the longer term. Finally, I want to talk briefly about what we can learn from the case of solar PV for other technologies, because technologies differ quite a bit in terms of their characteristics. And this is based on a paper I published with Professor Tobias Schmidt, my colleague at ETH Zurich. So solar PV and also LEDs are what we call type 1 technologies, which are simple standardized products with low barriers to entry and so high risks. And you have high economies of scale and global markets. So although the margins are low, because these are typically commodities where you're competing on price, you're basically depending on volumes and static cost advantages to capitalize on global markets. In contrast to this, you have type 2 technologies, which are relatively more complex in their product architecture and may need some extent of customization. So these are not standardized products, where since they are relatively complex, and since there is a scope for context-specific innovations, and since there are greater first-mover advantages and greater barriers to entry for new entrants, it makes sense for industrial policy to actually focus on these technologies and try and localize segments of global value chains within these technologies. Third type of technology that we categorize here are highly complex or highly customized technologies, which typically require high technological capabilities if they're very complex. So for example, nuclear power, where you have extremely low learning rates and you have extremely high risks. So typically these are large capital intensive technologies where there's a lot of technological uncertainty and a high requirement of technological capabilities. And in case they are highly customized, so for example, for geothermal or biomass power, they also represent small markets. So these are technologies that are probably better left, if they are highly complex, to more industrialized countries, where in the longer term we should perhaps try and build technological capabilities, but not make them the target of industrial policies. And if they're highly customized, then efforts need to be made to harmonize standards, aggregate markets, perhaps provide export credits and better characterize markets to provide the scale that might be required to promote industry in some of these technologies. So this is just to say that some of the learnings from solar PV are not universally applicable to other technologies, and that we should pick and choose our targets in terms of our industrial strategy and tailor our industrial strategy depending on the characteristics of the technology itself. So that's it from my side. I'm looking forward to discussing some of these findings.
Thank you, Abhishek. That was a I must confess, a fairly intense presentation in terms of the amount of information delivered. Um, and in the meanwhile, the chat box has been totally humming with people posting questions. So I'm just going to warn people we're not going to be able to go through all the questions in the remaining time, just that people just kind of manage their expectations. It's just a lot of questions and very good ones. So let me start with I guess there were a bunch of questions that were sent directly to me because I think people had trouble finding the everyone function on the chat box. So I'm going to pick up on a couple of those direct questions that came early, and then I think go to the questions that have been posted publicly. Uh, let me start with one question on um, uh, yeah, it says, and I think it may have been posted later also. This is from Subal Danta, who's an MPhil student from the Center for Development Studies, Kerala, who I think the question is addressed to the first speaker, which is how can firms attain both energy efficiency along with output growth? In other ways, what is the way out for overcoming the productivity dilemma hypothesis? Santosh, I mean, maybe, as I pose the question, maybe the speakers can just respond for a couple of minutes to the question, and hopefully we can just go through a whole bunch of questions one by one then.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, in fact, that is being a long debated discussion in the context of Chinese economy as well. That what is the way out that a firm can achieve energy intensity as well as become productive over a period of time. So that definitely needs technology support, and we need to have more and more information on various ways of technology. For instance, in this work, we talk about in-house R&D reported by the firms, and we really do not know whether they tend to be, in line of energy technology or not. They can be process technology, they can be other technologies as well. So a little bit more information on energy front, a little bit more information on technology front would definitely help. But of course, the other thing is the government has to push the most productive firms when they cross the threshold point, when they increase more output, then the government has to regulate these firms in terms of making them much more energy intensive. So the focus has to be different for firms which are increasing in output as compared to firms that are struggling to get into the threshold point.
Thanks, Santosh. One more question for you, which is from Rakesh Basant, who's asking this question. It's not very clear if R&D is affecting energy intensity after a lag. Is that the model that is being estimated? And the lags in the effect of technology, R&D, and tax on energy intensity need to be clearly articulated. So a little bit more, kind of just articulating that a little bit better and clarifying that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. In fact, I've written that. I also copied those questions from the text when I was listening. So, in fact, here the model being used is an auto-distributed lag model, not a lag-dependent model of energy intensity. So, what we are doing right now. So, in this equation, we have energy intensity as a function of other characteristics and lag of energy intensity for period one, period two, period three, and period four. What we infer is if a typical firm has been energy intensive for at least two periods, they tends to be energy efficient. However, it does not clear out the relationship between lag energy intensity with the current energy intensity argument. So what we have proposed to do are the following. One is you take the lag energy intensity as a y variable and regress it with the existing covariate, number one. Number two, you take the delta of energy intensity, which is nothing but the difference of energy intensity and the form characteristics. And number three is you take a growth rate of energy intensity over a period of time and you basically regress them. Then basically we get a clear picture of the lagged effect of energy intensity on the current energy intensity behavior of a form.
Thanks, Santosh. And one more question for you, and then maybe I'll go to a couple of questions for Abhishek and then come back to you with further questions. There's a whole bunch on the chat. So a question from Michael Tombak from the University of Toronto. So you're kind of getting global inputs on your work. The question is, Should the policy instrument depend on the state of economic development? In other words, perhaps taxes are appropriate for wealthy economies, whereas subsidies uh, or subsidized loans for green tech, from example, the World Bank, might be better for developing economies. In other words, encouraging economic growth while encouraging adoption of green technology. So what are your views on that? And any thoughts from especially your work on this question about choice of policy instrument?
Yeah, in fact, it's a wonderful suggestion. I agree completely with that statement of not focusing more on tax at this point of view. However, if we can see of Indian firms, then the government has been giving subsidies to various ways in terms of making firms energy efficient. However, that has not been worked out. And as we are growing over a period of time, we have become an emerging economy and we are still growing. So bringing the argument of tax actually helps as along with the advanced countries. So that was one of the argument of bringing tax into this context. I completely agree that the green tech is more important, subsidies are more important, and in fact, energy storage is more important in certain cases for differentiated energy consumption. Apart from the technologies on different energy technologies being developed. So yes, I completely agree on this argument of subsidies and green technology instead of tax based incentive for the firms rather than subsidy based intensive for the incentives for the firms.
Thanks, Santosh. So Abhishek, over to you with a few questions. Uh, from Pankaj Chandra, this question of, especially since you were talking about solar PV manufacturing, what is the binding constraint in solar PV manufacturing in India? Why is there low investment in its production in the country? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so thanks for that. To look at why solar PV manufacturing has not taken off in the case of India, I think you have to look at why it has taken off in China. So China took an early lead in terms of localizing manufacturing through a number of measures, actually. So they were quite. The story of China is very interesting because it was initially a lot of private entrepreneurs coming back from countries like Germany or Australia, coming back to China and setting up manufacturing to meet demand in Germany, actually. And this was when the industry was still at a nascent stage and technology was evolving very fast. And this initial push was then further amplified by the Chinese government, where they provided incentives for subsidized electricity, low-cost loans, all for the German market. So initially, there was virtually no domestic deployment, but the highly attractive feed-in tariffs in Germany led to an explosion in the global market, which China then capitalized on. But gradually, as we saw in the graphs, they also built up their R&D capabilities. So a lot of the knowledge in solar PV manufacturing is actually in the production processes. So the manufacturing equipment, all of it basically came from Germany, Switzerland, the US. But since the manufacturers had all the data which is required to optimize these processes, the production equipment manufacturers have to work closely with the manufacturers to help optimize these processes. So it was through this learning by interacting that a lot of knowledge transfer took place. And at the same time, China also is very good at scale, so manufacturing at scale. And since solar PV is a mass manufactured product, economies of scale really matter. And they're very good at optimizing manufacturing. So they did a lot of process innovations in terms of bringing down the cost of production and also optimizing their logistics, exporting globally at a low cost. So to come back to the case of India, one, there has not been this early push. China took an early lead and it was always cheaper to import solar panels. Domestic Indian manufacturers never got the kind of state support that Chinese manufacturers did. And finally, the Indian market, although it is large, was never large enough to create a protected market for Indian manufacturers to build up their capabilities. So basically, Indian manufacturers never had could never surpass the first mover advantage that Chinese manufacturers did. Although now we're trying to address that through multiple policy measures.
Thanks, Abhishek. One more question that I think maybe relates to that kind of uh, that matrix that you put up right towards the end of the work you did with Tobias, which is asking the question broadly about rooftop solar and trying to understand why rooftop solar installations are ridiculously low. This is from Supratim Das Gupta from Ahmedabad University. So basically, asking questions about rooftop solar. Why is the installation low, and is there any chance of meeting that 40 gigawatt installed capacity target? Uh,
Rooftop solar in India is particularly tricky for multiple reasons, depending on who is the customer that you're talking about. So a lot of residential loads in India are actually below cost recovery levels for distribution utilities. And the retail tariff is basically low enough that it does not make economic sense to install rooftop solar PV, because the electricity that you get from your rooftop solar PV is more expensive than what you pay for your retail tariff. So for residential customers, for rural customers, for agricultural loads, this holds true. For commercial and industrial customers, it does make sense, and that is indeed where you see rooftop solar PV taking off. But still, there are a lot of administrative hurdles that customers often have to go through. So distribution utilities do not make it easy for you to install rooftop solar PV panel with a bidirectional meter so that you can net off whatever electricity consumption that you have. Basically, to a large extent, because of what I just talked about, because to them, it is a threat to their own business. They are losing their best customers because of rooftop solar PV. So we need to think of creative ways of how distribution utilities do not see rooftop solar PV as a threat, but make them stakeholders. I mean, if you look at utilities in the West, they have diversified their businesses. They see themselves as energy service companies rather than companies that just sell kilowatt hours of electricity through the grid. So perhaps having distribution utilities who also are involved in the sales and installation of rooftop solar PV might address some of these difficulties.
Thanks, Abhishek. Well, there's a whole range of questions I'm trying to figure out, really of very varying kinds. But let me throw one more out to you. It's kind of slightly complex question. Well, a slightly long question at least. The question is from Parag Patel, who's from Ahmedabad, who is asking, there's a high degree of volatility in governance of renewable/clean energy in general and solar in particular in India. We have a complex problem of inconsistent manufacturing and import policies, coupled with states not honoring power purchasing agreements one after the other. And clearly, such an environment is a huge deterrent to big commitments and investments. So the question is the following. Is it deliberate, or are policymakers not able to estimate the falling price of solar PV and factor them into the policies? What do you think? And maybe just riff on that, and maybe even think more broadly about, how do we think about policy making in this area, especially relating to, especially manufacturing?
No, you've really hit the nail on the head in terms of outlining the key inconsistencies and uncertainties in Indian policymaking in the solar PV sector. I would not say that it is deliberate. It's definitely not, or at least I would hope so. But the cost reductions in solar PV, frankly, have taken everybody by surprise globally. If you look at projections for cost reductions for solar PV 10 years, even 5 years ago, nobody anticipated the kind of cost reductions that we're seeing today. And you can look at IEA reports, you can look at IRENA reports, you can look at BNEF, who are some of the most optimistic when it comes to making projections. Nobody was able to anticipate this positive feedback loop between falling prices, leading to increased deployment, leading to falling prices once more. When it comes to Indian policymakers, I feel like it is an issue with the way institutions for governance are set up in India, where it is extremely difficult to have a long planning horizon. And the kind of planning horizon that I'm talking about is similar to China, where they have plans for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So taking the case of lithium-ion batteries, they are dominant in the manufacture of lithium-ion batteries today, but that is a product of uh, 15 years of efforts in building up uh, manufacturing knowledge, capabilities, domestic markets, creating markets for e-bikes, for electric vehicles. So given the political system, and I'm not a political scientist, but based on what I know about policymaking in India, it's very difficult to have that kind of planning horizon and to provide that kind of certainty. What are some of the ways around that? I'm not sure, but that is something that I do intend to think deeply about in the near future.
Thanks, Abhishek. All right, so maybe we'll go back to Santosh for a question. Uh, it's actually a follow-up to Mikhail Tombak's question. And the question is the following: how would a cap and trade policy for emissions fare in a developing country like India with a large volume of small and medium industries and large corporations with the larger ones purchasing power for permits than the former?
Yeah, thank you very much. So in fact, certain variables of interest can help in answering these questions where this current paper has not taken into account. For example, the firms usually take embedded technology and disembodied technology imports. So, for example, if we have of course, the data is there. If we can add the data of drawing and design and technology being purchased from outside, plus, if we can also think in terms of the benefit that the firms have got from various policies, then the answer is pretty easy to explain. But at this point of time, it is difficult for me to answer the question because the data does not have this kind of indicators. So maybe it is better that I should look back and I should probably work a little bit more on that and link the idea of the study to more of a policy oriented research in terms of an academically empirically oriented research. So that's what at this point of time I can basically tell. And on the small and medium enterprises, in fact, we can see that large firms typically tends to do more R&D in the manufacturing segment itself. And the small and medium firms are not essentially the firms which are high on a technological front. And the small and medium firms are also not on the high in terms of the energy intensive firms. So what happens is within the set of the data that is being analyzed, there is a skewed distribution of firms with tremendous amount of energy being consumed and also high in terms of R&D. Similarly, firms which do not have such kind of characteristics. So to answer this for particularly small and medium industries, it would be better if I can segregate them and then re-estimate the model to give a preferably the best answer for the question.
Santosh, I might ask you a question actually, instead of reading things from the chat box, and we'll come back to the chat box in a second. I'm just reflecting on your study, and it's obviously a very important area to be understanding, trying to understand what determines shifts in or patterns of energy intensity in manufacturing firms in India. What is it that surprised you the most in your study? Is there anything that was counterintuitive?
Yeah.
Or particularly counterintuitive, let me say?
Yeah, see, if you empirically look at the paper or the data actually, so the ideal understanding is the pollutive forms should be energy intensive ones. I mean, that's the ideal understanding that, you're polluting because pollution is also, a summation of your air pollution, water pollution, etc., etc. Surprisingly, the polluting forms which are classified at the red category are not the forms which are actually using higher energy consumption in terms of physical unit. So I'm not talking in terms of the cost of the energy. Rather, I'm talking about the quantity of energy in physical unit, kilojoules unit being consumed. So why is that? I mean, what is the factor that actually deviate the understanding that the polluting forms should be ideally forms which are high energy intensive, but they are not. So the follow-up understanding is I have to actually look at what is the composition when the government classifies them in terms of pollution loads. For instance, if the pollution loads is more towards water pollution, then obviously the pharma company and chemical firms are going to be entrapped. And the aluminum company would exit because aluminum company may not necessarily pollute the water as the chemical companies are polluting the water. But if you look at the energy dependency, aluminum company needs much more energy as compared to the chemical forms, pharmaceutical forms. In the same way, if you look at the pharma companies, they spend more on R&D as compared to others. So in the manufacturing setup. So this is a kind of situation which I'm now thinking what should be the next level of thing, whether to do a specific study identifying the pharma companies or the chemical companies, chemical firms vis-a-vis the aluminum firms. A little bit of disaggregation of the work might help me in understanding this dilemma that I have, that why red category firms are not turning out to be energy intensive. And in fact, I have not shown you the descriptive statistics. In fact, the growth rate in the energy intensity, which is typically should be negative if they are moving towards energy efficient, seems to be pretty good in the yellow category forms, not in the case of the red category forms. So whether the policy is not directed towards the red category forms, which is already being kind of identified by none other than the government that they are the polluting forms. So can we have an heterogeneous in terms of policy also, like a different policy, not only based on the size of the firm, like generally people talk about large, medium, small, etc. But can we have a policy which is typically difficult for these energy intensive firms? And why this energy and firm age is also important. I thought that the older firms typically should be more energy efficient because learning by doing hypothesis helps. But in majority of the analysis, we didn't find that relationship to be consistent. Of course, somebody can question on the econometric specification that is employed, but in the descriptive, at least you should get the glance that, okay, the big firms, the older firms are typically energy intensive. So these are certain things which definitely kind of, I kind of see when I do the empirics.
Actually, in a related vein, one of the questions somebody has asked, actually Akriti Jain, who's a postdoc at ISC Bangalore, has asked whether this data on these categories, this red, green, orange, is it at the firm level or is it at the industry/sector level?
Yeah, so this is at the three-digit industry levels. So unfortunately, we don't have any information at the 5-digit level. So what we are doing right now, I mean, as a follow-up work is we are now estimating the emission at firm level. Because see, we have the fossil fuel consumption with us, then we have the IPCC equation or the procedure to calculate the carbon content. I mean, a bottom-up approach, basically. So what we are going to do right now, or in fact, the first stage of estimates are ready, that we are estimating emissions using firm level data, because emission data is not at all available with us. It's an aggregate data that we have. Firm level emission data we are computing, and probably we are trying to map it with the pollution loads. So, then probably we can customize the data in terms of pollution data or in terms of emission data at firm level, because firm level, there is no information, unfortunately, on emission or on pollution in Indian case. I mean, I'd be happy to know if somebody can tell me where the data is, because that's a green area where people can write a lot of papers.
Thanks, Santosh. Abhishek, question for you, and I think I'm pointing this towards you because I know you'll be able to talk to it, because I know you're thinking about these questions. This is Juhi Jain from Niti Aayog asking you, with investments towards a green economy, should we push for hydrogen energy through solar, or should we innovate to use solar independently to realize a dream of the renewable capacity target?
So, sorry, to clarify that question, the question is,
I think the question is, so maybe I'll take the liberty of rewording the question a bit, which is as we move towards our renewable capacity target, especially in solar, uh, should a push for hydrogen energy through solar be a central element of that, or is it that one can think about the deployment targets independent of the hydrogen question? In other words, are those, do we have to think of those as becoming intimately coupled, or is there a pathway for solar independent of hydrogen?
so we definitely have to think of complementarities between the two. So yes, solar will play a big role in decarbonizing the electricity sector, um, but green hydrogen and the manufacture of green hydrogen really depends on the availability of low-cost renewable energy. And so we have to think for ourselves as a country, what are our policy goals when it comes to hydrogen? Do we see ourselves as producers of green hydrogen? Uh, would that be for the domestic market, or do we want to export as well? If that is the case, then yes, we do have to think about how we can couple hydrogen production with renewable energy to produce cheap green hydrogen, both for domestic use as well as for export. Um, if not, if we realize that probably it makes economic sense to go down the same route as we did for solar PV, and we don't care about local manufacturing, which I don't think is the case. But if we do, then probably we can think of them independently and have a hydrogen strategy that is totally decoupled from a solar PV strategy, where we're mostly thinking of hydrogen similar to how we currently think about natural gas and maybe even oil in terms of securing international supplies and importing it. And finally, we also have to be clear about what are the kind of applications that we think will be feasible for green hydrogen in the near future. So again, if it is going to be small markets, so currently hydrogen is used for oil refining, for fertilizer manufacturing. If that is still going to be the case, and if that is it, those are the only markets that we're looking at, then it maybe is not such a big strategic priority. But given the current hype around hydrogen and given the enormous amounts of investments that are going into hydrogen, it is likely that hydrogen will find use in other sectors as well, for shipping, aviation, maybe long distance freight, trucking. And then one has to think, where are the electrolyzers going to come from? Who is going to manufacture them? So we have currently an opportunity where new firms are entering this space. Yesterday, I think it was just yesterday, that a Danish firm raised huge amounts of financing, venture capital for manufacturing of electrolyzers. So we don't maybe in that case want a situation where we're just repeating the PV story, where we're importing electrolyzers and using foreign technology to manufacture hydrogen. But we need to think about investments into creating markets for hydrogen, creating capabilities for electrolyzers and production of green hydrogen, and incentives for manufacturing hydrogen from right now, because arguably it might already be too late given the lead that countries like Germany and China have on India already.
Thanks, Abhishek. Maybe a couple of more questions for you before we kind of wrap it up. One is from Rakesh Basant again. You know, your categorization right towards the end, the type 1, type 2, type 3, in thinking about industrial policy. I think the question he's asking is, can we argue that the state should support innovation in your type 2 and type 3 categories?
So based on the analysis that we did, type 1 and type 3 are really difficult technologies to have an industrial strategy for. So type 1 technologies have low barriers to entry, high risks, low profit margins, Anybody can buy turnkey production equipment, and by purchasing the latest equipment, they can readily scale up manufacturing and become competitive. But it is very difficult to sustain that competitive advantage. Type 3 are difficult for a different reason. So for highly complex technologies such as nuclear, carbon capture and storage, very few companies and firms have the necessary technological capabilities. And so you have to be careful about investing public money there. If as a lower middle income country like India, you do not have the necessary technological capabilities, so maybe that is maybe a much longer term target and not something that you can look at immediately for industrial policy. Type 3 technologies, if they're highly customized, are not very attractive for industrial policy because generally you have very fragmented niche markets, such as those for biomass power or for geothermal power, where it becomes very difficult to scale beyond a certain point because as a biomass power producer, for example, you're limited by the availability and characteristics of the feedstock for which you're using to generate power. So if you're dependent on rice husk, you're really dependent on the availability of rice husk. It's not as modular or scalable as solar PV. And so to build a national industrial policy around technologies like that, again, becomes very difficult. So type 2 technologies kind of form the sweet spot where you have certain barriers to entry. If you're early enough to create a first mover advantage, you can build up the knowledge base, which is cumulative in nature, which becomes costly for new firms to acquire. And so there are these barriers that you can build around your competitive advantage. And there are, if there are mass customized products, there are opportunities to have locally customized modules for some of these technologies. So for example, for wind turbines, although they are highly standardized for certain wind classes, the towers or the blades might need certain adaptations for local conditions, which form a very good opportunity for a local industrial base. So you can have local manufacturing of certain modules within the technology. So yes, I would say type 2 technologies kind of form the sweet spot in terms of targets for industrial policy.
Okay, we're running out of time, but maybe just a couple of more questions before we end. So one last one to you, maybe Abhishek, which is asking about solar thermal, and what's your view on that, given the fact that it has potentially higher capacity utilization factors. This is, I think, from Supratim Dasgupta from Ahmedabad University again.
Solar thermal, personally, for me, has been something that has been a bit of a disappointment because it's kind of fallen by the wayside in favor of its much more exciting cousin, solar PV. So because of the highly dynamic nature of solar PV, generally a lot of public funds have been diverted towards solar PV and not that much attention has gone into solar thermal. Although in northern African countries, in Morocco, in Egypt, there still are quite a few projects which have achieved significant cost reductions through large scale, through advancements in concentrator technologies, and also through advancement in thermal storage. But the dynamics of cost reductions have not been the same as solar PV. So for every doubling of capacity for solar thermal, you don't see the same kind of cost reductions. So it is probably an attractive technology which may play a significant role in the future, but it has somehow just not had the kind of pull that solar PV has had in the past, that lithium-ion batteries are currently seeing, and that hydrogen is likely to have in the coming decade. But I do believe that it will play a small but important role in decarbonizing energy systems, particularly in hot, dry countries where the economics really makes sense.
Great, thanks. Okay, maybe, boy, I'm trying to be kind of balance it out there. So some people a lot of people have posted multiple questions, but I'm trying to give a little bit of airtime to people who posted fewer ones. So maybe Amruta, who's a PhD scholar from ISEC in Bangalore. Question is, and this is actually for Santosh, what is the impact of CSR policy on energy efficiency of firms belonging to polluting and non-polluting industries? Has there been any, have you thought about that or examined that at all, Santosh? Uh,
No, actually, to be very honest, I have wrote down this in my notebook when I was also copying. It's an interesting thing that somebody can actually dig in and then see if CSR activity has anything to do with, energy efficiency or any kind of environmental related aspects. So it's an interesting thing that I have never thought of. In fact, maybe because I'm trained in economics, so the CSR is little away from my thought process. Thank you very much for posting this question. I would definitely love to do something on this, you know, in these lines. Yeah.
Actually,
yeah,
Santosh, I've seen some work on how I think the CSR spending by polluting firms is a lot more compared to the non-polluting firms. So maybe we could actually look at that data.
Sure. In fact, as I said, like CSR is little kind of, as of now, it's not very close to my own research. So, it's a wonderful thing to link CSR with the polluting and non-polluting firms. And of course, as I said, we are making the database on firm level emissions. We would actually like to share the database with whoever is interested without any restrictions. So, then probably we can integrate those things and try to do something for the Indian manufacturing firms, or sorry, the manufacturing firms in India, because there are also foreign firms.
Is the signaling idea the polluting firms do CSR to sort of improve their reputation? So there is some literature on that. I don't want to get into that.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yeah.
great. Actually, both Santosh and Abhishek, there are questions in the chat, and actually not just questions, but comments on the answers and all of that. So maybe if I can ask Janak to save the chat and maybe then just share it with the two speakers so that they can both reach out to people who ask questions, but maybe we were not able to get to those. But also, I think they may benefit from the back and forth in the chat, because I know there's some very interesting thoughts and comments being put together, put in by various uh, participants, Pankaj, Rakesh, and others. So it may be beneficial all around. Okay, so it's been a very, I must confess, a very energetic and um, very thoughtful, very wide-ranging conversation, actually. And I must compliment both the speakers in their ability to take on with great aplomb questions of really great diversity, and being able to engage with them. And I think, to me, actually, what this conversation, the specifics of the conversation, but even the bigger topic, I think what really highlights is the need for uh, much greater focus on these questions relating to innovation and the environment. I think, really, as I would say, unpacking the black box of innovation and trying to understand what exactly is going on in various parts of the Indian energy economy, and its variations in performance. I mean, the reality is that this is going to be a long game for us, especially climate change, but of course it's not the only area. But many of these environmental areas, this is a long game, and we are going to have to be moving forward in much more thoughtful fashions in if we are to really marshal the opportunities offered to us by technology in addressing these environmental areas. We're really I must say, I think in India, we are kind of just uh, scraping the surface right now in our understanding of both patterns of energy performance of entities. And it's not just energy efficiency, but things like, How do we think about manufacturing? How do we think about innovation? How do we think about our position in the global supply chain? Those are going to be really big questions in the coming years. We're making huge investments in this area. And I think these kinds of questions need to be answered carefully so that we can direct policy in much more useful ways. I mean, I'll just reflect on a question that was asked, and which may, it may lead to some very counterintuitive kind of answers, right? One would assume that a very environmentally aggressive stance allows you great competitive advantage. And if you look at India's solar goals, solar PV goals of uh, the 100 gigawatt by 2022 that was declared at the Paris conference, right? That one would assume that, with that kind of very aggressive goal, one would be able to use that as a way to build up a market. But as Abhishek illustrated, the answer is sometimes not as simple as it seems, right? If you're deploying too fast, that may not give you enough time to build up the kind of the manufacturing base. And Pankaj, that gets to the question that you'd asked about, what's going on with manufacturing? Well, there are many things that might be going on with manufacturing, but one may be that your deployment targets are so intense that it's not leaving you enough time to innovate or build up your manufacturing goals. So these are and as I think as somebody just pointed in the chat box, that aggressive goals can be highly risky. So these are areas where we are going to have to be making a lot of policy decisions in the years to come, right? We just talked mostly about climate today, but the areas such as air pollution, right? We've got to understand, unpack those stories, unpack the dynamics of what's going on, and really understand where is it that technology could play a role, and strategically, how do we think about technology and innovation in addressing these challenges, and as Abhishek mentioned, and addressing possibly multiple policy goals. Uh, I, Scholarship in, I would actually say in this area, and actually there's a lot of people who are we had, I think at some point 120 people on the call, and I'm really delighted that we actually have a lot of people who are engaged in or hopefully interested in and hopefully engaged in these kind of questions, because I think we need many more people thinking about various dimensions of these questions. How does a country like India, with these major challenges, think about using science and technology in ways that allow us to meet these multiple goals? And we can never forget the economic development goal, right? It's obviously key one. And but it's not the only goal. And think about how to actually manage these goals. Where are the synergies? Where are the trade-offs? How does one use uh, uh, innovation strategically? China is a great example of a country that actually has done this. But as Abhishek said, it's been a long game. For China, many of these things for which they're reaping benefits today, they actually started with their 863 project back in 1986, right? So in a sense, many of the fruits are results of 20, 25 years of thinking and systematic engagement. Did they get everything right? No. But did they get some things right? Certainly. And so I think there's many lessons for us to draw from other countries, but also much deeper work in our own country in understanding many nuances of the kind both Abhishek and Santosh talked about today. So I certainly enjoyed the conversation, very rich conversation, a lot of really interesting questions, a lot of back and forth. It's exactly what one hopes a conference of this kind should be. So for me, it was a pleasure to.
It looks like we lost him.
Okay.
So on his behalf, we'll thank Ambuj and Abhishek and Santosh. Thank you very much. I think
Be moderating this discussion.
Okay, there you go.
Oh, he's back.
We lost you for a few minutes.
I think it's not fully there as yet. So
Okay.
Some technology issue has to be there in a technology conference.
But no,
Not at an IIT. You can't have this at IIT. So.
Oh, we can. Don't even get me started.
Okay.
If you really want to unpack the black box of innovation, let me start with the IITs. Anyway, Janak, back to you.
No, I think great session, and really thank you, Ambuj, for really managing this really so well, and to Abhishek and to Santosh for their very interesting and diverse presentations.